Good evening, everyone. My name is Jesse Macadang. I am a graduate student in the University of Washington's Engage program, here to welcome you tonight to our event. In my research, I studied how to grow a little piece of heart tissue in the lab in order to better understand heart disease. I gave my talk here on April 11th, and the video will be posted on the Engage's website shortly. Please check it out at engage-science.com. I got to have the opportunity to talk here because of the special collaboration between Town Hall and the UW's Engage program. Together they host a series called UW Science Now as part of the Seattle Science Lectures. Sponsors include Microsoft and KPLU. And now on to our speaker tonight. Natalia Woodward just graduated from the UW's School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. Her interest in aquatic ecosystems originated from chasing minnows in the creek behind her house where she grew up. After receiving a bachelor's degree in biology and environmental science, she went to Alaska to chase salmon before landing here in Seattle. Now that she's finished her thesis, she will be chasing career opportunities, hopefully for not very long. Tonight, she'll tell us about climate change and keeping our lakes healthy into the future. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Natalia.
Thanks, Jesse, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I know most people in this room, but I'm Natalia Woodward, and in the town hall flyer, this talk starts out climate change and then lakes, but I'm actually going to be talking mostly about lakes and water pollution and how, we manage for that, and then I'll go into a little bit about like how climate change is just making that harder for us. But this is mostly a talk about water quality. And before I go into that, I wanted to give you a little introduction into how I ended up in the School of Marine Affairs and the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences. So this is me in first grade, and these are my gerbils, Paul and Blackie, and this is a paper that I wrote, and I'll read it to you. It says, when I grow up, I want to be a zookeeper. I want to be a zookeeper because I'll get to take care of animals and clean their cages. I would like this career. I think to be a zookeeper, you have to go to college. And so this is a picture that I drew that's attached to this paper. I grew up in the DC area, and this is the birdhouse of the National Zoo. And down in the bottom corner, I want to point out there's a peacock that's pooping, and this is me, and I'm shoveling its poop. So needless to say, I was pretty realistic about my career aspirations. But as I grew older, I realized that the real world isn't like a zoo. We don't have people in one corner of the world and animals in the other corner. But it's more like everyone is interacting. People and animals are sharing the same environment. So we have like a town in Belize where people are building up among a tropical rainforest, or fishermen in Alaska that are sharing a food resource with other animals. And even here in Seattle, we have a big growing city, and we are really appreciative of the natural resources around us. So this is my study site. It should be a very familiar picture to most, if not all of you in the audience. We have Seattle in the red dot here, and Lake Washington and Lake Sammamish are the two lakes that I study. And these lakes, you can see here, and these lakes are very similar. They're very close to each other. They're both glacially created. But Lake Sammamish is a smaller lake. Lake Washington is bigger and deeper. And these two lakes have a very interesting history. If there are any older folks in the audience, you might remember that back prior to the 1960s, these lakes were not actually swimmable. So this is a poster from that time period, and King County Metro was actually created to clean up the water quality in Lake Washington. It wasn't originally a bus transfer service. But the reason that these two lakes were filthy back then was because there were sewage treatment plants along both of these lakes, and they were dumping inadequately treated sewage water into the two lakes. So I'm talking about poop again. If any of you are gardeners, you might see this picture and think, oh, manure, I want to use it in my garden. So poop is really high in nutrients that are really good for plants for growing. So if you're a gardener and you want to grow some plants, you might go to a garden store and buy some fertilizer. And if you're doing that, you'll probably notice that there are often 3 numbers on this bag of fertilizer. And this is the NKP ratio, which is the ratio of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in fertilizer. These are 3 really important nutrients for plants. So we have nitrogen, which is really good for above ground leafy growth. So if you're trying to plant a lawn, if you want to buy turf fertilizer, you're going to get a fertilizer that's high in nitrogen. Also, if you're trying to grow lettuce or broccoli. And then we have phosphorus, which is really good for root growth, and it helps bring flowering plants into maturity. So for example, if you're trying to grow tomatoes, tomatoes grow really well with high phosphorus content fertilizer. And finally, we have potassium. And potassium is just really important for overall disease resistance and plant health. A lot of fertilizers that are for winterizing will contain high levels of potassium to keep plants strong in colder weather. So if you go home, you buy your fertilizer, you're trying to grow a plant, you still need a few other things. You need sun, here's your fertilizer, and you need sun, and you need water. And this is true both for plants that grow in your garden and also plants that grow in lakes. And it's also true for algae, which are similar to plants. They're very small photosynthetic organisms, so they use sunlight to make food. And they need sunlight, they need water readily available because they're in a lake, and they need some sort of way to get nutrients. This picture is an experimental lake. You can see in the top, it's like dark lake color, and then the bottom is very green, and there's this barrier in between. And what happened in this experiment was whoever was doing this experiment dumped a bunch of phosphorus in this bottom part of the lake, and you can see it kind of confirmed that phosphorus caused all this algae growth. And so that's what happened in Lake Washington and Lake Sammamish prior to the 1960s. We had all this improperly treated sewage water coming into the lakes, providing all these nutrients for excess algae growth. And that process is called eutrophication. So eutrophication, excess nutrients leading to excess algae growth. And this is a problem not only in Washington State, but around the world. So thankfully for Lake Washington and Lake Sammamish, in this particular case, it was really easy to clean up these lakes. This nutrient pollution source was coming from a point source. And what that means is that it was coming from a directly identifiable source, so these sewage treatment plants. So we were able to just say, no, like we don't want this in our lakes anymore, and we were able to clean them up. And point source pollution is really easy to control for that reason. You can just identify it and then control it and regulate it. So it's not really a problem in the US anymore. But my story about these 2 lakes isn't quite over yet. When the county decided to clean these lakes up and divert the sewage water, Lake Washington recovered very quickly. I'm going to show you a graph. So in this graph, we have time over here. This bottom line is representing the amount of sewage water going into the lake, and this line is representing the amount of phosphorus that was collected from the lake. So you can see here, this was the point of the sewage diversion, and so the sewage levels went down very quickly, and so did the phosphorus levels in Lake Washington. So in a few short years, Lake Washington was fully recovered. It was back to being clean and clear, and we could swim in it again. And Lake Washington is actually a very famous example of lake restoration. It's one of the most successful examples of lake restoration in the whole world. So just for me, researching that lake is pretty cool because in my field, it's a famous lake. Lake Sammamish, however, has a little bit of a different story. It's clean now, people can swim in it. It didn't recover as quickly. In this figure, you can see that these are the phosphorus levels in Lake Sammamish before the sewage was diverted, and these are the phosphorus levels after. And you can see they're not that different. You don't see this drastic decline like you did in Lake Washington. And we understand that to be because Lake Sammamish goes anoxic. Okay, big science word. Anoxic means depleted or lacking in oxygen. And I'm going to explain why Lake Sammamish gets that way. So here's a lake in the winter. It's cold out, there's not much sunlight, so there's not much growth going on. We do have phosphorus coming in across the landscape, and we have oxygen coming in from the atmosphere. Otherwise, like I said, not much growth. One thing that's really interesting about lakes that have both phosphorus and oxygen in them is that there's a chemical reaction that happens in which the presence of oxygen shunts phosphorus out of the water and into the sediments. So you have this process of oxygen allowing phosphorus to get stored in the lake sediments at the bottom of the lake here. And actually the presence of oxygen is really important for controlling phosphorus levels in lakes when we're trying to limit nutrients in lakes and keep the algae growth down, because you have this process of phosphorus being stored. Anyway, if we move through the seasons, it starts to get warmer, the sun comes out. So there's been all these nutrients that have been accumulating over the winter. It becomes warm enough for algae to grow. So we get algae that are taking advantage of sunlight, taking advantage of nutrients. They're plant-like, so they're producing oxygen. And this is all normal, all lakes do this. You get a growing season where you have growth in lakes. The problem happens when you have excess nutrients, this eutrophication process, and you get excess algae growth. And what happens when you have so much algae growing is they basically eat themselves out of house and home. They run out of food. And so then they're like, oh no, we've used up all our nutrients. So they die, settle to the bottom of the lake. And then what happens is you have bacteria coming in to eat them. Bacteria in lakes are like earthworms. They're eating dead matter, decomposing stuff. So they're consuming all this algae that's available to them now. And I want you to notice, so there's oxygen up here. The bacteria, like us, we're using oxygen as we go about our day-to-day activities. Bacteria are also consuming oxygen. So when there are a lot of algae dying, there's a lot of bacteria growing, and they're consuming a lot of oxygen. So they deplete the oxygen in the bottom of the lake, and that's when you get this anoxic state. And I know I pointed out that there's oxygen in the top of the lake, and that's not actually accessible to the bacteria or anything going on in the deep part of the lake. Lake Sammamish and Lake Washington are both very deep lakes in general compared to lakes throughout the country or ponds. They're fairly large, and so you get these different zones in the lake, and so that's why even though there's oxygen at the top of the lake, it becomes anoxic in the bottom. But again, because there's no oxygen in the bottom of the lake, this phosphorus that's been stored in the sediments here is able to be released back into the water column. So it goes back up into the water column, and all of a sudden there's nutrients in the lake again. And this creates this cycle where you have a lot of algae growth, they all die, deplete oxygen, phosphorus is released, and then there's nutrients available for more algae to grow. And so you see this cycle here, algae dying, oxygen being depleted, phosphorus being released. And that's why Lake Sammamish recovered much more slowly, because in Lake Washington, it's a very large lake, so it would need more algae for it to become anoxic, whereas because Lake Sammamish is smaller, the same amount of algae is kind of crowding the lake, and so it was much slower. Let's see. And so, like I said, though, we've cleaned these two lakes up, but eutrophication is still a problem. And that's because there are other sources of nutrient pollution besides these point sources, such as sewer pipes. And these are called non-point sources of pollution. So some examples of these are, for example, we've been talking about poop this whole time. It's going to be a theme throughout. Animal waste, high in nutrients. When it rains and that washes down a storm drain, it can go into our water system and provide nutrients for algae to grow. Washing your car with soap. Soap is often high in phosphorus. In Washington State, you actually cannot buy soap with phosphorus in it, but in a lot of other places it's high in phosphorus. So people who wash their cars in their driveways and that soap goes down the storm drain, that's another way you end up with nutrients in our bodies of water. And then many activities across an agricultural landscape are high in nutrients. So again, like animal waste from farm animals, fertilizer of crops, all those things, again, when it rains, these things can go into a body of water. So non-point sources of pollution are very hard to control because you can't really identify them. You can't say, oh, this dog in this spot is polluting, like put it away. You just have all these different activities across the human landscape that are bringing nutrients into bodies of water. So another interesting thing, particularly for King County, this is a figure of a modern sewer system, and I'm going to talk you through it. You have your house here, you have someone showering, and so all this wastewater, like from your sink, from your shower, from your toilet, is hooked up to a sewer system. So it's going to go from your house through a sewer pipe into a treatment plant. And then storm water goes through a storm drain, and it's in a separate pipe that's going out. Here in this case, it would be going out to Puget Sound. But in King County, we have some old sewer systems, and they're called combined sewers. You might recognize this picture. Let me get back to that actually. But so in a combined sewer, both the storm drain and the sewage drain are connected, and they're both going to the treatment plant. However, there's an overflow pipe, and so in heavy rains, you can get an overflow of your sewage water and your storm water out into the environment. So it's going out instead of into the treatment plant. And so that's what this sign is there are different locations around the county where combined sewers overflow in heavy rain, and those are at times public safety risks because you're going to be exposed to fecal coliform bacteria, for example. So that's also a thing that we're dealing with at the county, trying to manage our water quality. So I'm finally getting to climate change. In this region, what we know about climate change is that things are getting warmer, which means that there's going to be a longer growing season. This is going to exacerbate that cycle I was telling you about of algae growing and dying and bringing phosphorus up. So particularly in lakes that go anoxic, they're going to be particularly sensitive to climate change because they just have a longer period of time for phosphorus to be stored in the sediments, be released, to be used and recycled. And that was actually what my thesis research was about. I'm not talking about it too much here, but I'd be happy to answer more questions about it. The other thing, though, is we know that in the winter, we're going to be getting a lot more precipitation as rain rather than snow. So all of these things that are happening on the landscape that get into our bodies of water during rainstorms are going to be increasing in number. So it's more likely that we'll get more of these combined sewer overflow problems. We're going to just be getting a lot more runoff coming off of our activities going into I'm not making sense. We're getting a lot of runoff going into our bodies of water. And so personally, I think this is really scary because it's hard. Like again, most of these activities are things that we can't regulate on a governmental level. And the way I kind of like resolve that for myself is think, well, how can I help? Like, what can I do as an individual person? So here are 3 easy things that you can do. The first is super easy because The suggestion is don't buy soap that contains phosphorus in it, and if you live in Washington State, it's actually very hard to do because there's a phosphorus ban for both detergents and turf fertilizer. So that's kind of a really easy thing to do. If you're listening in from somewhere else, you can maybe look for those in like natural stores. The other thing is to wash your car in a car wash. Again, I was talking about soaps here don't have phosphorus in them, but general pollution problems. If you're trying to keep like oil from cars out of your water system, car washes are regulated the way all their wastewater drains is set up, like how our house is set up. So it's going to a proper place to treat water. Whereas if you are just washing your car in a driveway, all of that is just going down the storm drain. So washing your car in a car wash is a lot more healthy for the environment. And then the third thing is scoop your poop. I think a lot of people learn to do that from sort of like a respect others, like we don't want to see poop on the street kind of thing, but it's also really important on an environmental level. Because dog poop actually has more nitrogen and phosphorus in it than human poop does. And then if you're feeling, so these are simple things that you can do. If you're feeling ambitious, and particularly if you own a house, there are a lot of things you can do on your property that can help you keep pollutants out of the water system. So I guess this is a little bit blurry. I'm gonna walk you guys through it. All of the suggestions on this picture are basically ways to keep water out of storm drains and trying to hold it in the soil as much as possible. So things like building a rain barrel where you're catching that rainwater rather than having it wash into the street. You can implement permeable pavement. So rather than having asphalt, there's different kinds of pavers that allow water to seep through them to go into the soil rather than into the street. Let's see, you can plant trees. These help deflect the flow of water, and again, roots help stabilize soil and can help capture water in the soil. And this says redirect downspouts. So again, if you're directing that into sort of a gardeny area rather than into your gutter, that's going to help reduce your storm water flow. And then finally, you can build a rain garden. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, because if you're feeling very ambitious about building a rain garden, the county will actually reimburse you for the cost of doing so. And let's see, if you're in these particular colored areas, they will actually pay you to do this. But what a rain garden is this picture here is showing, or let me start down here. If you don't have a rain garden and it rains, you get rain coming off of your house in your driveway, it's going to the storm drain, it's going directly into Puget Sound. If you do have a rain garden, instead of going this way, all that water is going to go this way. It's going to be captured by native plants, which are also good for wildlife. It's slowing down all that erosion that might be happening. It's capturing pollutants that might be carried in that water system. And a lot of plants will also filter a lot of pollutants and take them out of the system. So when this water does get into Puget Sound or to a lake, it's much cleaner. So these are some suggestions, and that's really all I have for you. So I wanted to make sure I addressed all the people that have helped me. My funding for my graduate research came from the Mellon Foundation, the City of Seattle, a Keeler professorship, and a Bullitt professorship, and these are actually all funding that my professor Daniel Schindler obtained, so I should be thanking him as well. The Engage program for giving me this opportunity, and Town Hall for hosting us. And King County I worked with on my thesis research, and the College of the Environment, who supports all of these endeavors. And I posted the website of the Rainwise program if anyone was interested in the rain gardens or other ways that you can address water management at your own home. Thanks. I can't see anybody, so. Thanks,
So
Jesse.
you mentioned that with climate change, there will be a shift between rain during the winters versus snow. Can you explain the difference between, does snow, just because it melts slower, does then it prevent more of the runoff from going into our streams, or how does that?
Okay. I think I need to repeat the question here for our live stream. So Jesse was asking me why it's better when it snows for water pollution than rain. And so basically when it snows, you're not getting all this runoff. Like if it's really cold, you get snow and it just sits there, right? Like if you think about a mountain, it snows and then it's like snowy on the mountain until spring. So I guess the difference would be getting that runoff happening slowly over time throughout the winter versus all at once at spring melt. That aspect of climate change impacts in this area is not something I'm super familiar with.
So I have a two-part question. The first one deals with this notion of climate change lengthening sort of the nutrient cycle in lakes, leading, I think, to oxygen depletion. Is that tied to, or is that the direct phenomena that leads to acidification, or are those separate phenomena? So that's sort of my first part of my question, or first question. My second question is, what sort of a reasonable worst case scenario for lake health in sort of a post-significant climate change era? Are we talking about 2 or 3% additional problems, or are we talking about sort of like massive transformations of lake health with, you know, massive implications for a wide variety of species, et cetera? Thank you.
Sure. So the first question was whether the stuff I talked about tonight was related to acidification. To my knowledge, acidification is happening in oceans, not lakes. And so I don't know if that's a process that's happening in lakes. I know the little that I do know about ocean acidification is related to the increasing levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and that getting absorbed into ocean water and changing ocean chemistry. I haven't ever come across that happening, hearing about that in a lake system. Let me see if I remember your, could you repeat your second question?
It just gets at what's sort of the worst case or reasonable scenario of, you know, with climate change in terms of impacts on the lake.
Okay, so the second question was, what's the worst case scenario? When people climate scientists talk about climate models, there's a lot of different, they say like, oh, this is like the conservative model, and we're expecting, if we use this model, we would expect a certain degree change in our weather or in our climate, and the worst case scenario would be a much bigger degree change. And I'm not sure that something that extensive has been done particularly for lakes. Those types of predictions are sort of like big global models. One related thought that I'd been thinking about was, could Lake Washington and Lake Sammamish go back to being unswimmable? And just based on my opinion alone, I would imagine that's possible if it's already been shown that that's something that can. The problem, so I guess the worst case scenario would be all lakes everywhere going eutrophic. And this is a problem because, again, depletion of oxygen really diminishes available habitat for fish, for example. There's been a lot of research about the problems with eutrophication. So diminishing fish habitat, reducing species diversity, causing shifts in species diversity. One thing that some people in this area have been studying are increased incidence of toxic algae blooms rather than just general green algae blooms. Some of the species that are toxic to like humans and dogs are really good at using phosphorus. So in particular, I was talking about phosphorus. And then there's also like socioeconomic problems with eutrophication. You diminish, like for example, shoreline property value. If there's a lot of economy related to like lakes, like fishing and swimming and jet skiing. And if you're getting these really dirty lakes just full of algae, and that's gonna go down. So there's both like biological and socioeconomic impacts of this. Did that answer everything?
Yeah,
okay. Any more questions?
So what was your actual research? What did you find in relation to climate change in those two lakes?
Okay, so for my research, I was comparing how Lake Washington and Lake Sammamish were responding to climate change. And this was based on previous studies in my lab that had shown that, yes, Lake Washington is warmer than it was 40 years ago. And my follow-up questions were, okay, if we know these lakes are getting warmer, what does that mean for these nutrient cycles? And I already knew that Lake Sammamish and went anoxic and Lake Washington didn't. So my hypothesis was that Lake Sammamish would be much more sensitive to these warmer temperatures because of that phosphorus cycle, and Lake Washington would not be. And that was what I confirmed in my research. That what I did was I took 20 years of data and I looked at warm years and cold years, and I saw that in warmer years there were much higher phosphorus concentrations in Lake Sammamish in warmer years than colder years, whereas in Lake Washington there wasn't a relationship between the warm and cold years and the levels of phosphorus in that lake. Just a fun fact, in this area about half of our lakes are anoxic, so this has implications for example, management. If we're trying to pick which lakes we're most concerned about, we might want to address lakes that go anoxic more strongly than lakes that don't, because they're more at risk in a warmer climate situation. Hello.
Piggybacking on this question, do you know where the priority of lake preservation comes into King County, or what their priority level is? Are they actively continuing to try and reverse it, or is it kind of we stopped the big dumping and now we're just kind of hoping it doesn't get worse? If you know, I know there's a lot of issues King County deals with.
Right.
Where lakes fall into that.
Oh, so the question was, how does King County currently prioritize lake management? And the county has two programs in their Department of Natural Resources. They have like a large lakes program, which monitors Lake Washington, Lake Sammamish, and Lake Union. And then they have a small lakes section, which manages all the small lakes like Cottage Lake, Beaver Lake, Bitter Lake, all the small lakes that have like little communities around them. I know for the large lakes, they have a lot of long-term monitoring. Actually, Lake Washington has been monitored since the sewage diversion in the 60s, so it's a very large data set. I'm not as familiar with the monitoring of the small lakes program. I don't know if they're actively addressing climate change currently. In the county's comprehensive plan, they've acknowledged that this is something they're concerned about and they want to do research about it. What they do currently do for lake management is lakes have this thing called total maximum daily loads. And so for lakes that are problematic and polluted, the state actually sets goals for water quality, and we're required to collect data every year to make sure that the lakes are meeting those goals. Whether this is an effective management policy or not, there's a lot of people in the county that would have opinions about that, because a lot of people say once a lake gets listed under this impaired lake list, it's very hard to get it off. And so I guess in summary, it's a really hard thing to do.
All right, thank you, Tala.
Thanks, Juliana.